Okay.
And if you kind of run out of stuff to say, pause and I'll give you the next prompt.
Oh, don't you worry. I won't run out. You don't have to prompt me. I'm Mr. Gab.
So what sorry, let me start over.
I might have to prompt you.
So the first questions we have.
Why even ask many questions? I could rattle on for hours.
Well, why don't you start with back at the beginning? Where were you born and when?
I was born in Murray, Utah in 1942, March 25th, 1942.
Was there anything about your birth that was interesting or out of the norm?
Oh, I'm sure they were there recording it. It was probably on black TV, but nothing that I can remember.
Okay,
I just popped right out there.
What's your earliest memory? I mean, hopefully you don't remember the popping out part, but what's the earliest thing you remember?
My earliest memory that I have been thinking about is my parents had gone to a movie and my brothers and sisters were sleeping downstairs and I was upstairs and I thought everybody had left and I was real small, old enough to, I guess, to walk, and so I thought I'd been deserted, so I went over to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door and said, my parents are gone and they've left me alone.
How old were you?
I wasn't very old because I didn't go look for my children, for my brothers and sisters. I just went over to the neighbors. Happened to be that he was the basketball coach at BYU and real nice fellow. He used to, as I got older, he used to come out and play basketball with us and just a great family. So they kept me there till my parents got home, and my mother and dad, I think, were a little ashamed that my brothers and sisters weren't watching me. So I was 8 years younger than my next oldest brother.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
Well, I had two brothers. One was killed in the Second World War, Dwayne, and two sisters, and Maureen, Joanne, and Gordon. Dwayne was killed when I was 3 years old, so I don't ever really remember Dwayne.
You don't have any memories of Dwayne?
No, just through pictures, and the last letter that he wrote before he was killed was, I can't wait to get home to hold little Lenny. We all had nicknames growing up, and being Stephen Lynn, they referred to me as Lenny for quite a few years.
And what were the nicknames of your other siblings?
Well, they all had first names like Faye Maureen, and they called her Maureen, and Gordon Albert was still Gordon, and Joanne was I don't know, I can't remember for sure what hers was, but anyway, they all went by the middle name versus the first name.
So you were born in Utah. What did your parents do? What was life like?
Well, my dad was a general contractor, and they used to build. He started out as a bricklayer, and they had a very large brick crew, and they used to lay a lot of J.C. Penney stores and big commercial buildings. And we had a fairly big yard where we had fruit trees and we had chickens, and so it was a very fun childhood. We had what they called the big ditch across the street where I used to go up that ditch and play up through the trees up there, and there was a lot of hobos that used to hang out up there, And my parents used to always say, watch out for those hobos and don't get too close to them. And they'd kind of build caves up there where they lived. And so I had a real fun childhood, and I enjoyed life. I used to ride my bike all over, and I don't think in those days parents were as worried as they are now about letting their children go wherever they'd like to go, because things were much simpler then, I think, they are now.
Except for the hobos.
Except for the hobos.
So tell us what you remember about your dad.
Well, my dad always had to work. He always was a hard worker. The one thing, and I don't really remember this, I was too young, but during the Depression, my dad had to drive clear out to Tooele on Sunday night. He'd work out at Tooele, and they were building these big chimneys out at the Tooele Ordnance Depot. And he used to get paid $5 a day, working 5 days for $25, which was, during the Depression, that was pretty good money in comparison to what most people were getting. And so he'd stay out there and then come home on Friday night. But I don't really recall that. I was too young. But I remember going to work with my dad when I was real small, and that was what I always wanted to be, was a builder, being with my dad. And I thought a lot of my dad. And we were very close growing up. And I always enjoyed going up to the cabin with my dad. And one thing that I think was very memorable was when we built our cabin. I was about 12 years of age. And my dad and I decided that we'd stay up there during the week, several days. And so we had a big double bed, and we put it under these pine trees. And he'd had a series of heart problems, and so he would have to rest. So he'd work on the cabin for a while, and then he'd have a nap. And when he had a nap, I'd go fishing. And then I'd come back, and at night we would sleep in this big double bed. And on more than one occasion, it rained. So we had a big canvas that we just pull over the top of us. And I got very close to my dad that summer because we spent a lot of time together. And I've always thought back about those times, that they were wonderful times in my life, to be with my dad that much.
Cool.
We didn't get a lot of rain on us because we were under this big pine tree, but we'd get little. And so a lot of when he would be resting in the afternoon, he'd have a nap and rest because of the heart problems he had. And I'd go hiking, and one day when I was hiking, I saw this doe that was up in the trees, and I walked up towards her, and she had just had a baby. And you could still see the afterbirth on the little fawn that was laying there in the bushes. So I didn't get very close to it. I didn't want to create a problem with the mother, but I thought that was something to see, a birth of a little fawn that had just happened. I'm sure it wasn't very long ago, with the afterbirth still on it. So I had a lot of wonderful little adventures being up in the cabin all the time.
The one you built, which of the...
It was a block one behind the first one that you remember. That one we tore down. And we found newspapers in there that dated back to 1864. And those were miners that lived in those cabins, and they mined the Cardiff mine, which is up the road just a little ways. And that's where they actually lived. And there was a stable behind, which is still there. There isn't much left to it. But then farther up the creek, a little farther up, there was another structure that was they called it Robber's Roost, that was a tavern where the miners used to hang out and drink. And that's gone too. It's not there any longer. But there's a lot of history to that property. And so it was actually homesteaded. So my dad was actually able to get a deed to the property, which a lot of the property up there is on a 99-year lease through the government, but ours is actually deeded.
So you talked a little bit about your dad. Tell us a little bit about your mom. What do you remember about her?
She was a very special lady, and she, I think, was a Relief Society president. I don't know how many different times, both stake and ward, and she was always helping someone. And we had several weddings at our house for other people that were in the ward, and she would make the wedding dress and everything for a lot of people who couldn't afford to have a wedding. And at her funeral, a lot of people that came through said, if it hadn't been for your mother, we wouldn't have had a wedding, or a lot of things that happened in their life they wouldn't have had. And she was always helping people, and financially she helped a lot of people in the area that I didn't know about until at the time of her funeral, as they came through and told about all the things that they had done for them. And I don't ever remember hearing my mother swear. I don't think she ever swore. Now, on my side, occasional swearing, and my dad would swear occasionally, but my mother never would. And she actually, the day that she died, it was on Halloween, and I normally would never stop off there in the morning before I went to work, but something prompted me to stop off, and so I did. I went and sat on the bed. It was quite early in the morning. She hadn't got up yet, and we sit and talked for a long period of time. And I was just grateful that I had spent that time with her, because she went to Relief Society that day and actually died there at Relief Society, which was an appropriate place for her to die, because she spent so much time there at the church, and had a massive heart attack. But actually, the Sunday before that, she insisted that everybody in the family come to Sunday dinner. And I was a bishop at the time, and said, well, I can't come that night because I've got too many things going. She said, yes, you can. You be there. I don't want any excuses. I don't want no from anyone. I think she really knew that she wasn't going to be around much longer. And she insisted that all of us be there that Sunday night, because the following Tuesday is when she died. So she was a special lady, and we had a wonderful relationship. She used to be very active, and she'd go out and throw a ball with me when I was little, and did a lot of fun things with her. And it almost broke my heart, because my mother and dad came at the end of my mission, and we toured 11 different countries from England on, and she was walking with the cane. And I had never seen her in that position. Usually she was so active, I couldn't believe that she had to use a cane. So I felt really bad to see her in that position, but her hips were going, and she had arthritis so bad in her hips that she had to end up using a cane. But I had a very special relationship with my parents.
How old were you when your mom passed away?
I was, and I'm just kind of guessing here, but I think I was around 26, something like that.
What about when you
No, I would have been a little older. I'd probably been closer, because I was made a bishop when I was 29. So I was probably about around 29 when she died.
How old were you when your father passed away?
Not much older, because she died at 66, and he died at 72. So there wasn't that many years between the two of them passing away. So I wasn't a lot older when he died.
So you talk a little bit about your parents. Now, how do you think your parents would have described you as a child?
Well, I hoped that they would have had a positive attitude about me as a child. You never know, but I tried. I kind of saw some of the things that my brother did that kind of upset my parents that I didn't want to do. He was a good kid, but he made some mistakes that I guess I learned from that I didn't want to make, and make my parents feel bad towards me by making the same mistake. So I tried not to. One thing that was fun about my my mother is she told me, she says, "Now if you'll watch Lawrence Welk with me on Saturday night," which I hated, "I'll watch wrestling with you after Lawrence Welk." And so we did. We watched those two programs, and I actually convinced them to take me up to Salt Lake to the Coliseum to watch wrestling live. And I always used to think that it wasn't put on at all. And when we were there, some of the characters that we saw there was women hitting other women with folding chairs, and it was a pretty rough place to go. And it probably wasn't the best place for us to go see, but I convinced them that it would be a very fun activity. And it turned out to be very fun just watching the characters up there.
Do you remember any of the wrestlers' names?
Oh yeah, Gorgeous George was one of them, who had, I think his hair was pink or something, and it was against the rules for him to touch his hair. And I mean, it was such a put on that it was ridiculous. And Iron Mike Mazurki, and I don't remember many of the others, but those two stand out in my mind.
What year do you think this was?
I was probably about 12, maybe 13, something like that. I was really into watching it on television.
So this has got to be what? You were born when? 30?
42.
42?
So
mid-50s?
Yeah, mid-50s.
I don't think any of the grandkids could ever imagine Grandpa as a fan of professional wrestling and at a show with Iron Mike Bazurki and
Gorgeous George. That was pretty interesting. And for my mother to sit up and watch wrestling with me was pretty good too. Because my dad, he says, "I'm not watching that junk. I'm going to bed." But she was pretty good about doing what I wanted her to do.
So I've got one more question for early childhood. Are there any stories about, maybe your grandparents that people may have forgotten, that may not be written down anywhere, that you want people to remember? Your grandparents or other elder relatives?
Well, I can't say a lot about my grandparents because both my grandfathers died before I was even born, so I don't even remember my grandfathers. My two grandmothers, the one on my mother's side was Swedish, and she had come over from Sweden as a young girl and had joined the church and came over here. And she was quite a tall lady, but my grandma Tripp on my dad's side was only 4'9", and she was very short. And I remember both of them had very long hair. And we used to go over to my mother's mother. They had a farm in Midvale, and there was a big barn behind their house that we used to go play in the barn. And I don't remember a lot about them because I was pretty small when both of them died. But my grandma Malmstrom, she got Alzheimer's when she was older and used to come and stay with us sometimes. And she'd say, "Well, I want to go home now. I'm going to leave and go home." And my sister and I had tried to hold her, and she was so strong she'd just throw us out of the way, and out the door she'd go. So we'd have to try to follow her so she didn't get run over or something, but try to bring her back. But
So you have to go wrangle your grandmother with Alzheimer's.
yeah, so it was. That's it's unfortunate because a lot of our grandkids have seen both grandparents and on both sides, but I don't really recall mine that much. I wish I would have. Actually, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, Enoch Bartlett Tripp, had 5 wives and 36 children. So he was quite a guy.
Busy man.
And I actually, when I was riding my bike, I rode my bike over to Murray on this trail. It told all about Enoch Bartlett Tripp, who was my great-grandfather. And it told about how they used to race their horses down Tripp Lane. There's a Tripp Lane in Murray, and then there's also a Tripp Lane in Draper where we used to live. That was named after us, and it told about his boys and how they'd race their horses. And evidently there must have been some of them that were a little on the wild side because they had a tavern over there. And it told about the tavern they had in Murray, and so it was just interesting to read a little bit about my great-grandfather. And I could go on and on stories about him because he actually taught Joseph Smith's children back in Nauvoo. And he came to Nauvoo because he heard there was some cheap ground that he could buy because they were being kicked out of there, and so that's why he went there originally. And then he was actually joined the church, and he was, when he joined the church, he was baptized in a bathtub because they weren't doing baptisms because of all the persecution. So Heber C. Kimball baptized him in a bathtub. And then they told him to stay behind and not tell anybody that he was a member. And so he was actually selling some of their properties for them and actually acting as an agent. And then when he came to Salt Lake, he had a store there, and so he came with several Conestoga wagons. And in his wagon, he had a big stove and a big bed in there, and he came in luxury compared with my grandparents on the other side, who came with a handcart. On the Malmstrom side, those that came from Sweden actually walked across the plains pulling a handcart. So my grandpa Tripp, he went in real luxury compared to them.
So
But
he was able to, in his wagon, use the stove?
yeah, he had a stove, a big bed, everything set up. And then he had all these other wagons full of provisions that he was taking to Salt Lake to set up another store. And he was quite a businessman. But it was interesting to find out a little bit about him. And he was sent on a mission back, and he went back and he visited Emma Smith, Joseph's wife. And she says, "Now I can die in peace because Enoch's come back and has visited us." And because he was very close to Joseph and Emma when he was back there. And the children really thought a lot about him. We read in one of the books that the children, he was their favorite teacher in school. So it was fun to learn a little bit about him. My grandpa Malmstrom was killed in a logging accident. He was hauling logs down from the canyon, and I can't remember if the team rolled over, or somehow the wagon rolled over and on top of him and killed him. But he was killed quite young in an accident. And how my grandpa Tripp died, I'm not sure. I don't really recall how he died, but I wished I'd have known him better, but didn't have that opportunity.
It's kind of interesting to see a little bit of each of them kind of distilled into you. You know, I know you've always had horses. You know, you talked about one of your grandfathers racing horses down Tripp Lane. You talked about a appreciation for luxury travel. You know, with the stove and the big bed and the wagon, similar to your motorhomes and trailers that you've had over the years. Business, you know, being a good businessman with, different land dealings, you know, the different strip malls you built, you know, working with your dad. And it's really kind of cool to see all that kind of, you know.
You know, you gain a lot of knowledge through your ancestors and through your parents. And just one little example of that really started me off was my dad gave each one of the children $3,000 one time. And my oldest sister, they had a home, and they probably just put the money in the bank. But my other sister and my brother both bought cars. And I had a car. But I went and took mine and put a down payment on a building lot. And I made payments on that lot all through high school. And I had that lot paid for before I went on my mission. So it was about a $4,000 lot, which in those days, it was a brand new building lot in a new subdivision. And so when I came back from my mission, I had some ideas about building some other things. So I sold the lot, so I had some money, and I made about $2,500 on that lot in the 2 years. And so I kept thinking, you know, maybe that's where the money is in property. And I learned from my dad, because he had actually 7 homes that he'd built and carried the contract on. And I used to see the people come by the first of the month and bring him a check. And he was the bank. And I used to think, you know, that's the position you want to be in. You want to be the bank. You don't want to you don't want to owe the bank. And so through my dad, I learned a very lot of very positive business ideas, and how important it was to use your money wisely and use it effectively. And so I really feel like my dad and my mother really taught me some real good examples financially.
Very good. So moving on, so we got a lot about your childhood, you know, great stuff with your parents and ancestors, and so getting into high school. Where did you attend high school?
Jordan High School.
Where's that?
That's in Sandy.
In Sandy, okay.
Yeah.
What were some of your favorite things to study in high school?
Oh, industrial arts, all the shop classes, and there was a couple of law classes I liked, but I really enjoyed the shop classes. In fact, I went to a high school reunion several years later, and 2 of my friends were putting on, I don't know if you ever remember, but on TV, Carson, I can't remember his first name. He had a program on TV where he'd put on this, it was like a kind of a hat thing. And when he put it on, then he could read people's minds, and he would hold up a paper and all this. And they were portraying this. And one of the things that they said was Stephen Tripp. He was his grades in school were FFA, F for math, F for English, and A for industrial arts. And that's one of the things they said. And then they showed a picture on the screen of these little Chinamen in there digging this trench, and that was my construction crew. And so I thought it was kind of funny that they did this about me at our high school reunion, but they were both my good friends, and so I was really the butt of the joke there at that reunion. But I enjoyed high school. I had a lot of friends in high school. In junior high, I ran track, and I enjoyed running track, and I could have in high school too, but I think my main objective in life was I wanted to get a car, and in order to get that car, I was going to have to pay for it and take care of it, and so I ended up working all through high school. I could have went out for sports, but I didn't. I just worked, and but part of that working in high school was so I could pay that lot off besides pay my car off, which I did both. And then but I really enjoyed high school, and I had a lot of friends in high school.
Do you still keep in touch with any of those friends?
A lot of them have died, unfortunately. My best friend, who was my best friend all the way from kindergarten through college, died when he was 26. He had some rare disease that passed from every other generation in his family. And I don't even recall what it was, but he died, and at a very young age because of this particular thing. And so he used to ask me a lot about the church, and I'd tell him, well, he couldn't believe I went on a mission. He says, that's the biggest waste of time for 2 years. Why do you go on a mission? And so I had to explain all that to him. And then we'd talk about the Book of Mormon and different things, and he'd listen. But I could really, he was a good kid, and we were good friends, but I knew that I'd probably never convert him because, you know, he was so well grounded in his own religion. And he was very religious, but he was good. But we had a really good relationship and enjoyed being with each other. And he and I were probably the closest of any of my friends. But 2 or 3 of my other friends that I was really close with have died now too, of various things. So I've still got some, but you get busy and with a big family and everything, and so you kind of lose track of them. But I have a lot of people that I knew in high school that I run into all the time that weren't real close friends, but that I enjoy seeing when I have the opportunity.
What was you talked about your best friend Don, what was his name? Roger
Bianchi. And he was a Catholic boy. He used to come to Mutual with me once in a while. But his uncle was a priest. And Roger used to, when he got his driver's license, he used to take the nuns to church every once in a while. And so they were very active in his church. But the interesting thing is Roger never smoked or he never drank. I don't even recall him drinking coffee. He was a good LDS boy that was not LDS. But he and I were best friends all through school. The one problem was, though, before I could drive, before I had my license, his cousins would come and pick me up for school, and they were Catholics too, but they'd always smoke on the way to school. And so by the time I got to school, I smelled like a cigarette butt. And I think everybody probably thought I was smoking too. But Roger and I would sit in the back seat and neither one of us smoked. But so probably when I went on a mission, there's a lot of them thought, that kid, he smoked all through high school. But of course, once I got a car, I didn't ever ride with them anymore. But it was interesting to be with those kids. But they were good kids. But the smoking wasn't, they smoked. That was just their way of life. Their parents all smoked. But they were friends, and so I didn't really hang out with them at all, but I did with Roger.
Did you go to college?
I did.
Where'd you go?
I went up to the University of Utah for probably approximately 2 years, and then I went to business college for about 1.5 years. But I actually had to quit college because my dad had a real serious heart attack, so I had to take over the business. And but I don't regret it. I feel like that's what I want to do anyway, was be a builder. So.
He was a mason, correct?
No, he was a general contractor.
Okay.
He started out as a mason, and then after he had his first heart attack, he decided that he would go into general contracting and build homes instead of the big commercial buildings that they were doing. So he started building homes, and then I'd go to work with him all the time. And as a young boy, in fact, when I was about 13 and 14, he let me drive the pickup truck everywhere. And by the time I got my driver's license, I'd been driving for a couple of years, and unfortunately, but I probably wasn't picking up the best driving habits, but at least I had been driving a lot.
And so, I mean, your grandkids all look at you as someone who had a very successful career. As you left college and took over your father's business for him, is that where the success began, and it was just success from then until now?
No, it's taken a long period of time. It's just gradually, and some years were very rough. Some years we didn't hardly make anything at all. In fact, probably the worst year that we had is when Steve was on his mission financially. Because prior to that, we'd supported several missionaries. But I could only pay about half of his support because financially we were really hurting. So with the construction business, you have some good years and some bad years. And that's why I decided to diversify and get more into the buildings that I owned, rather than trying to rely strictly on the construction end. Because about every 10 years there's a big upturn or downturn, and so financially there's a lot of problems. So that's why I started getting into buildings that we owned ourselves, rather than building for other people as much.
Were there, during construction, I understand it's somewhat of a risky business, were there ever any great risks you took as an entrepreneur that worked very, very well? And are there great risks you took that turned out poorly?
Oh yeah. I built some apartments up by the University of Utah, and built some apartments down by BYU, and they turned out fairly well. In fact, the one at the U, I got back. I sold it once, got it back again, and sold it again. But some of them were very good, but there's been others where I've bought property and there's been a big downturn, and in fact, when I was first starting out, I started building a subdivision out in West Jordan, and I had about 7 houses built with mortgages on all 7. I couldn't sell them, And I had a realtor that was working on them, and I happened to read in the paper where you could get these farm loans in rural areas, and it only required $200 down to get in a home. And so I put an ad in the paper, and the realtor called me one Saturday morning and said, "I've got people lined up out here to buy these houses. So you better come out and help me because I can't handle them all." And so we sold them all that Saturday. And it went from worrying whether or not I was going to have enough money to continue to pay for the houses that I already built, but they were able to sell them all that time. Then I built a lot of them under this farm loan program where it only required a person $200 to get into a house. And so they were more than happy to buy these because of the rural area where we were building them.
You sold 7 houses in one day.
Yeah.
Cha-ching.
Yeah.
That was fun taking those checks to the bank.
And we could have pre-sold as many as we wanted, but we wanted to make sure the pricing was right before we sold them. But that was probably a good turn. I've bid some churches and some schools where I've left some things out on the bid and we didn't do too well on. Usually developing property and that type of thing has been more profitable than actually a lot of the construction in some ways. But I found out that where I could build buildings and rent them out over a long period of time, that really was much more financially stable than any other thing I could do. So the last probably 20 or 25 years, I've concentrated on more of that type of construction.
What would you say is your greatest or most significant accomplishment as a professional?
Oh, I don't know. Some of the churches and schools that I built, I was very proud of, and just about any building. You know, it makes you proud to drive down a road and see a building that you constructed, and it makes you proud to have known that you built it. I think that just being a part of construction and what goes, you know, how long it takes from when you pour the footings till you move that person in, whether it's a school or what it is, it requires a lot of time, and you're very, very much involved. And so I feel like that's always been an accomplishment, to say that I've completed everything I've ever built.
So never an abandoned project?
I never have. Never taken out bankruptcy. Never have. I can never say that anyone who's ever worked for me has ever lost a nickel, because I've always paid everything up. In fact, we were real hurting one year, so I went to work for actually for another construction company for a couple of years. And prior to going to work for him, I made sure that everybody that had worked for me, I took every nickel out of all my savings that I had and paid everybody off. And basically we had nothing in our savings left. And I went to work for another construction company, or I went to work for the Salt Lake School District. For a short time, I was over all their maintenance of the schools. And they wanted me to stay there, but another construction company wanted me to come work for them, so I did, where I was making a little more money for another year or two, and then finally got back on my own, which I really disliked working for someone else, and was glad when I could finally get back on my own again. And so we had some very difficult years. They weren't always years where you can say it was profitable, because some of them weren't. But that's those are lessons that you don't forget. and so you try not to do the same thing again. But I feel like it's been a successful life, and I feel good about everything that's happened.
So how many children do you have?
My last count, there was 8.
That's the count Grandma gave us as well, which is good to know.
Okay.
Let's see here. How many children? What was your overarching goal as a parent? Or what should be the goal of parents?
Well, I think the goal that I always felt was to raise good children that were honest, hardworking, and love the Lord.
Looking back as a father, would you have done things differently?
Well, I'm sure we would all do things differently, because you don't get a book on raising children, and every child's different. And so you have to just do it the best you can. And I have to give a lot of credit to Sherry for the raising of the children, because I was working a lot. I was gone a lot working. I was put in the bishopric when I was 24, I believe it was. I was made a bishop at 29. So I wasn't home a lot. I was gone an awful lot. And so I have to say that a lot of the day-to-day upbringing was Sherry's. It wasn't mine. But we used to have a lot of fun going on trips, a lot of activities together, and going up to the cabin. So we still spend a lot of time. But she was probably with them more daily than I was on a day-to-day basis. But I feel like we have really good children that we've raised.
And so, in what ways did your parents' way of parenting influence you as a parent?
Well, they were very patient, and I remember one time when I was a priest, our priest advisor invited us to go rabbit hunting on a Sunday. And I went and told my parents, I said, "Do you think it'd be all right if I went?" And they says, "That's got to be your decision. You're, as a priest, I was 16 then. And they says, you're old enough to know right from wrong. You make that decision." And I made the wrong decision, and I went rabbit hunting on that Sunday. And our priest took about 6 of us in his old car. We went out in the western desert, went rabbit hunting. Both of his tires blew out on his car. We had no way of getting back. So there wasn't any priest to bless the sacrament. And so, nameless to say, the next day he was released from his calling. And it made me think, I made the wrong decision to go. But my parents allowed me to make the wrong decision. And I think as parents, sometimes we have to let our children make some wrong decisions so they know that which way they should really have gone. And so I think you have to raise children very carefully and not try to just have an iron fist when it comes to raising them. You've got to be very, very, very careful how they're raised. And I think that's the way my parents were. They were very, very good about raising me and allowing me to make a few mistakes in my life.
So, having 8 kids, there has to be a number of interesting stories over the years. I mean, as one of your grandchildren, and being around you for the past 30 years, I have a handful of great stories just that happen to do with you and Grandma. With Lisa, with my mom, there's a story about you and her camping, and something with there was beans, and something happened with the horses. What happened?
Well, I tried the first few years when we had the horses before we moved to try to on a weekend on a Friday night and Saturday to take each child alone on the horses, and we'd go up into the mountains, and it was their responsibility to take the food, whatever we were going to eat for dinner that night. And as I recall, Lisa brought bread and a can of beans, and that was our dinner. And so we put them in the saddlebags, and off we went and rode the horse up into the mountains. And I built this fire and tied the horses up. I thought I had them securely tied, but I didn't even think about it. And Lisa just put the whole can of beans in the fire, and we didn't cut the top or anything off. And I came back from taking care of the horses. All of a sudden, the beans blew up, and we had beans all over us. Both Lisa and I were covered with beans. And so basically, our bean supper was all over us. And we had bread to eat that night. And so when we woke up in the morning, the horses were gone. They had got loose and went home. And so Lisa and I had to walk back home.
How long of a walk was it?
Oh, it probably took us maybe an hour and a half from where we were. Maybe a little longer. But, you know, those are the type of activities that you never forget. And I'm glad that we had it. You know, Lisa's never forgotten that, nor have I, because it was just, you know, it was a rough night, but, it was one of those activities that you look back on. Maybe it wasn't that pleasant that night, but it turned out to be a very fun activity.
You know, that's very true. I think of all of the stories, the most memorable ones, they're never pleasant with you and Grandma. Not to say that you're unpleasant people, but the most fun and exciting stories, the ones that we really remember, are like the time I burned my finger on the cigarette lighter in the U-Haul, the time you forgot to put the plug in the boat, and about turning my dad into a pancake on the dock. Just always fun stuff.
Well, there's always, unless you have some bad experiences that you can look back on, you don't know how much enjoyment you get out of not having bad experiences, I guess.
I want to go back just real quick to questions about the kids. What kind of a parent were you with your children?
Well, you'll probably have to ask them to find out the answer. But in my own mind, I could say I was a wonderful parent. But in the children's minds, I might have been a terrible parent. I'm not sure. But I did the best I knew how to do. And as a parent, that's about all you can do. We used to always made sure our children went to church. And in fact, in priesthood meeting last Sunday, they were talking about different things. And Steve is in our ward, and Steve brought up, my parents used to say, you can go to church happy or you can go to church sad, but you go to church. So, and that's what our children knew. Every Sunday we went to church. And I also tried to teach them the importance of working hard. And I think that's been instilled in all of our children. And they've all been hard workers. And so if for nothing else, I taught them how to work. And but I hope that I taught them some other things also.
How would you describe Grandma as a parent? Maybe more of the characteristics.
She was more the disciplinarian than I was. If they acted up or did something, she'd spank them or whatever. And I very seldom ever did spank any of them. I remember one time Steve was doing something. I think he's actually teasing Lisa or something. Something was going on. And I remember slugging him once. But as far as spanking him or disciplining him, I wasn't that type of parent. But I remember Jenny and some of the kids got into our neighbor, had some old cars that were, the windows were broken out and everything, and I told them they absolutely couldn't play over there because they'd get cut. But they did, and Jenny happened to be the last one in the bathtub, and I went and she slapped her bare butt, and you could see the handprint on her rear end. And there was occasion when Becky used to get me upset, and I used to take this belt and double it up and snap it so you could hear it snap, and tell him I was going to whip him with the belt, which I never did, but it looked scary. So I was never really the disciplinarian. So I remember once we were sitting at the table and something came up, made me mad, and I took a box of cereal and chucked it at the wall, and you know, all the kids laughed. So you could tell them how much fear they had about their dad. So they weren't too concerned.
Let's see. Okay, so next is the story about Steve somehow ended up on the roof of a home as a young boy. What happened?
Well, when he was about 3, Sherry had gone somewhere, and so she left me to attend him, and I had to leave to go to a job. And my dad was there next door shingling a house, which was actually about 1.5 stories tall. It was a pretty tall house on the one side. And so my dad says, well, I'll watch him for you while you're gone. So he took him up the ladder and put him on the roof. And he was sitting on the ridge of the roof, and he would slide shingles down to my dad so he could shingle. And when Sherry came home and saw him up there, I mean, she was frantic. She thought, you know, he is 3 years old up on the top of the roof, handing shingles down. So, needless to say, she was pretty upset with me. But my dad says, oh, he's safe up here. There's not a problem.
Let's see. So I guess there's a story about Becky's boyfriend and a car ending up in a ditch.
Well,
there's a story about Becky and her boyfriend. What happened?
We had various occasions when we had somebody go in our ditch. There was a big, and you probably remember it, there was a big ditch almost the size of a canal in front of our house. There was the lane, and then there was this ditch. Well, a lot of the kids who had come there didn't realize it was even there. And it was dark at night, and this one boy that was there, he come out about 40 miles an hour, and all of a sudden his headlights were pointed straight up in the air, and he'd gone into the ditch. And so I had a big old dump truck that was there, and so I hooked a chain on and pulled him out. But we had that happen more than once. Had these kids that would come and visit and go in the ditch. But we had quite a few experiences with that ditch.
So Nikki always wanted to be a nurse, from what we've been told.
Right.
And it seems that she has cared for you quite a bit. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, as a little child, she'd always have to. She had all these little nursing kit, and she'd always have to check your heart and pretend being a nurse when she was very small, and she always wanted to be a nurse. And when I'm grateful that she is a nurse because she actually saved her mother's life because her oxygen was down to 55 after we came home from the hospital. And if she would have gone to bed that night and not realized this, she would have died. But Nikki checked her oxygen and said, we need to get into the emergency right now, which we did. And it saved her life. When I was in having open heart surgery, one night I didn't realize that they were monitoring this because I had a little thing in my pocket here, but they were actually supposedly monitoring this. But my heart just started racing, and it got up to 175 beats a minute, and I thought I was going to have a massive heart attack. And I kept pushing the button for the nurse to come, and no one responded. And Nikki and Grandma had just gone home. And so I called Nikki, and I said, you got to come in here. I can't get any nurses to respond. I don't know what to do. So she dashed in and came in. And after that, she told the nurses that I'm going to stay with my dad every night until he's released. And she did. And I think the nurses were grateful because it was during the COVID and there wasn't nearly enough nurses to take care of the patients. So she stayed all night at night and made sure I was all right. And then Jenny would come in and stay all day. And then Grandma would come and stay whenever, she wanted to, but she would stay most of the days too. But they had it worked out so she could go home because, it's difficult to stay there all day in the hospital. But I'm just grateful that Nikki is always wanted to be a nurse and has been such a helpful nurse to us when we've had health problems, and we can always count on her. And Jenny, for her to come and spend all day long with me every day, it made a real difference because you just didn't know if a nurse was going to come in or not.
Tell us about the time, I guess there was a number of times. So Jenny has always seemed to have loved the outdoors. She climbed, it was Kilimanjaro. She's always loved the outdoors. Tell us about Jenny. I hear there's some stories of her as a young girl, and there's a dog and a field.
Jenny always had a dog. She had several dogs. Some of them, unfortunately, we had some block out in front, and one of the dogs got his paw in it and broke his leg, and I used to have to do away with a dog or two. I don't know how much this should be recorded, but Jenny always had dogs, and she loved dogs, and she's got a big old German Shepherd now. But I would see Jenny out in the fields, and this little white blonde ponytail would be bobbing up and down out in those fields, and her and the dogs would be running through the fields when I'd come home from work at night. One night I came home, we were building a new house next to the house we were living in, and I went into the house, and out popped Jenny out of the basement crawl space with the dog, and then she'd carry the dog up the ladder so they could go up to the second floor, and she just always loved dogs, and she was always out in the field, and she was a very the type of girl that loved to be outside. And like you said, she climbed Kilimanjaro, and she's always loved to go camping and that type of thing. And so she's been a real outdoors girl her whole life. And she's moved on to bigger things. She now is in a new position that she just received that put her in a high position both within the state and with the job that she's doing.
there's a famous story that dealt with you and Mike, and now learning that you were a big fan of professional wrestling as a young kid, it makes a little bit more sense. But tell us about what happened with you and Mike.
Oh, I used to always kind of choke the kids just for fun, and hopefully, if I choked them hard enough, they might. No, but I used to just for fun choke them and different things. And one time I had Mike and I was choking him, and he literally passed out on the floor. So evidently, there was something in his throat that must have got pressed that caused him to pass out. But after that, I was a little more careful how I choked the kids.
And is it true so you're roughhousing, give him some sort of headlock, he goes down, and does he wake right back up? What happened?
Well, he was out for a little bit, but I don't know how long, but he had passed out. But Mike was an interesting kid. He was one that I could tell a million stories about. He broke his leg. He climbed up the ladder to dunk the basketball, fell off the ladder and broke his arm. And we were taking him to the hospital repeatedly, all the time. And I'm surprised that they didn't have us checked out for child abuse. And when he was 2 years old, I ran right over him with a truck. Went right over his chest. You could see the tire marks on his chest. We'd come home and I had an office and shop in the back of the house, and I told the kids, I says, Mike keeps coming out there on his big wheeler, so come and get him and take him in the house. And I saw him take him in. I figured he was in the house now, but he had driven the big wheeler right up behind the back wheel, and he was just sitting there. And I backed out of the truck and filled this big clunk, like when I went over the top of him. And so I didn't know what to do, so we hurried and put him in the truck and took him to the doctor, because by the time we would have got the ambulance there, it would have been too late, I was afraid. And then another time, my first brand new car, he started up the tiller and ran right along the side of the car and tilled the side of the car with the tiller. I just barely bought it. Another time, Steve had a truck parked and our driveway was kind of on a slope. He lifted Marcy in the back of the truck. He got in the front and released the brake and took it out of gear and rolled down and did some damage to the truck. And when we took the truck in to get fixed, it was being driven by a 5-year-old. And so Mike had a very interesting childhood. There's many other stories I could tell about Mike.
So with Stephanie, who was Puny? Tell us about Puny.
Well, that was a little story I made up about Stephanie. She was a very picky eater and would hardly eat anything. And so she was just very picky. And so I thought of some way that I could express to her in a story form about eating. And so I made up this little story about Puny. And I told this story to the kids about how this little child kept eating less and less, and she became so small that she was about the size of a little bird. And so we were afraid she'd get stepped on or run over, so we put her in a bird cage and would leave the door open so she could get out of the bird cage, but that's where we put her, was in this bird cage, and she'd just eat bird seed. And so she was so small. And so it went on, that that's where she lived, was in this little bird cage. Well, somehow or other she developed wings so she could fly or walk or get around. But so anyway, our house caught fire. And in reality, it didn't catch fire, but this is part of the story, that our house caught fire. And so Puny actually flew out of the cage, flew up and started waking up all the children and waking up Grandma and I and telling us the house was on fire, we had to get out of the house. And she saved our lives. And so some of the kids could probably tell the story better than I can because they've heard it a few times. But anyway, that was the gist of the story, was about her not eating. And now she saved all of our lives. Marcy was our youngest child, and one thing that Marcy, I can remember a lot of things. She was a sweet little girl, but one thing that I do remember when she was real small, both her and Mike, actually, I think Sherry was videoing this, and Mike, I was laying on the couch and Mike was laying on top of me, and he was telling me something. And when he was little, he kind of stuttered or stammered or something. He didn't really stutter, but it was kind of hard to understand what he was saying. So I says, Marcy, what's Mike saying? So she was younger than Mike, so she'd have to interpret for me as to what Mike was saying. And Marcy came out of the womb talking, I really do believe, because she always had something to say as a small child, but she was a very special little child, and we loved every one of them. But she was the youngest, so she probably stayed home with her mother longer than any of the others.
Did you always want a big family?
Well, when we first got married, we talked about having 12 children. And I think it was more of a joke than with me anyway, than it was with Sherry, because she couldn't wait to have a child. In fact, she was so anxious to have a child that she just couldn't wait. And I think that's the only reason she got married, is so she could have a child legally. And but anyway, so 8 was 4 short of 12, so that was probably good. But we'd kind of wanted a big family.
Now, with those 8 children, what's your favorite vacation that you've done as a whole family unit?
Oh boy, that's hard to say because we did a lot of them, but mostly the camping ones when we'd go camping, and I used to take them deer hunting when they were younger, and we'd go deer hunting and take the horses, and you know, we had some experience with the horses where they would get loose and we'd have to go catch them and various things. But I just think just the camping experiences were some of the funnest that we had. We couldn't afford to take any real trips like the kids take today and go in planes and go to Europe or wherever. The only time I ever flew in a plane was when I went on my mission to England. And so all of our trips were mostly in the motorhome or just camping trips that we did together. But we did a lot of fishing and hunting together as a family, and I think they all really enjoyed those type of trips. And yeah, as they were young, growing up, like I say, we didn't have a lot of money, so we couldn't afford to do a lot of real, you know, extravagant trips. But as I recall, they were all real fun trips.
How did you meet Grandma?
We met at a movie, which is probably where we could have, the only place we could have met, because Sherry loved to go to movies. And when she was young, her father managed the show house, and so She used to go to all the movies all the time. And that's where she actually, I was there with some of my friends, missionary friends who had just got back from missions, and we went to this show. And it was Kitten Without a Whip, Kitten with a Whip, or something like that. Anyway, it was an interesting show. And so she was sitting in front of me, and she turned around and asked me what time it was, because she didn't have a watch and was supposed to meet her brother, because they'd been to the Thanksgiving parade or something. And so I told her the time and talked to her for just a minute. And so I had this plan in mind. I was going to go, I asked her if she wanted some popcorn. I was going to go buy her some popcorn and go sit by her, because she was by herself going to go meet her brother. And anyway, that didn't materialize, but she had a card that was her dental card, and she wrote her name and phone number on the card and gave it to me. And so then I called her up and we went on a date. But you know, her living in Salt Lake and me living in Midvale, we would have never met if we hadn't met at that particular show house. So it was really fate that we met. And so we started dating, and several months later we got married. But that's basically how we met, was at a show house.
What was the first date?
I think the first date we went to was Mary Poppins, as I recall. And it was Walt Disney, of course, but but it was just a matter of quite a few dates after that.
How did you propose to Grandma?
Oh, it was very romantic. Let me tell you, I'm probably the most romantic person you would ever know. You know how romantic the kids are today. They're on their knees and everything. And I said, we were sitting in the car, and I said, you know, if I asked you to be I said, now I'm not sure of the dialogue here. I got to think about this. But something about, if I ask you to, I don't know. I don't think it was if I ask you to be the mother of my child. I think it was if I ask you to be my wife, would you marry me? Something that was very, very romantic like that. And evidently she said yes, and it went on from there. But you know, I should have been on my knees and everything else to. But as she can attest to, I'm not a romantic person, so she knew what she was getting up front. And also, when I would call, I'd ask her on a date, and that was it. I was through. She'd say, well, all these other boys call, and we'll talk for hours. And I says, well, mine's short and brief. If you want to go on a date, fine. If you don't, that's it. But so I was never one to sit and chat on the phone.
What do you think your in-laws thought of you?
Well, I think, according to Sherry, they were impressed with me. Whether they'd never really ever told me that, but because when I went there, the first date, I told them I was a returned missionary, and I told them that we were building the Utah Boys Ranch out in Kearns, my dad and I. This was for children that had been taken away from their parents and various reasons. We were building this big ranch. It's just a commercial building is what it was. And I told them about that, and they said, oh yeah, Sherry's uncle, he's does stonework and that. And so I think I made a fairly good impression on them. And according to Sherry, her dad quite liked me, so he didn't ever say he liked me or anything, but according to Sherry, he, I guess, kind of liked me.
Well, speaking about your marriage, what do you think is the key to a happy marriage?
Well, I think probably the first key is to realize that you're equals. It's a partnership. It's not a dictatorship. And I think when we first started out, we thought it as a dictatorship, and I was going to run everything, and she was used to her dad dictating everything to her, so she wasn't going to run everything. So we kind of butted heads for the first while, and her idea with money is you go buy. This was her parents' idea. You go buy it now, pay for it later. My idea with money is you save up until you've got enough money to pay for it, and then you buy it. And so we had a few things that we had to work out the first few years of our marriage, and the best thing was when she took over the checkbook and started paying the bills, and I just left that up to her. So she knew how much money we had and how much she could spend. And that made life much easier. And she found out that when she married me that I'd never even worried about balancing my checkbook because I figured I always had money in there. So as long as I had money in there, I was going to worry about balancing the checkbook. So I let her take that over, and things were much happier after she realized, okay, we've got this much money to spend. And she began to change her attitude about, we save up and then we buy it. And so I think that it definitely has to be a partnership or it won't last.
So Mallory specifically has asked, how haven't you and Grandma killed each other by now?
Well, maybe she hasn't had a sharp enough knife to stick in me when I was asleep. I don't know. But I think it's got to be a matter of love. If you love a person, regardless of what happens, you love them regardless. And you get through life. We've been together now for probably, 54 years. And, there's been some rocky years where it hasn't all been that wonderful, both financially and everything, in other ways. But if you love a person enough and you realize, look, we're married in the temple. We're married for time and all eternity. You don't just give up on somebody. If you were married until death do you part, it'd be much easier to part. But after you've had a temple marriage and have a testimony of the temple and what it all means, it's much harder to think about divorce.
So you've always liked to hunt. Are there any fun stories about hunting that you can remember?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of fun stories about hunting. One time, my brother and I were sitting down against a tree. We were both sleeping, and this deer came up the trail and came up within about 3 feet of me, and I raised my rifle up and didn't even get to put it on my shoulder, shot it, and it almost fell on top of us, and my brother claims he had blood all over him, and whether he did, I don't know, but it certainly scared him when the gun went off, and that was a little experience we had. Another one with Steve when we were pheasant hunting, and we got out of the car and there was a pheasant sitting on this barbed wire fence, and evidently its feet were caught in it or it was already dead. I can't remember which, but he started shooting at it and it was spinning around the fence, and I don't know how many times he hit it or didn't hit it, but it kept spinning, and that was quite a fun experience. And I remember one time Steve was on the back of the horse and we were chasing a coyote I was trying to shoot. And I ducked down because there was a low branch and forgot to tell him to duck. And he went off the back of the horse. And that was kind of a different experience. Another time, a new time in my life. It was storming, and so we couldn't work. we were pouring concrete or something going to that day, and it was stormy, so we couldn't work. So anyway, I told Luke, I says, let's go pheasant hunting. And he was working for me. I says, go over to the high school and get Steve out of high school and tell him that somebody in the family died or whatever. Tell him to get him out and we'll go pheasant hunting. So he went and got him. And when Steve came out, he told him his Uncle Pheasant died. And that's why he got him out of school.
Uncle Rooster?
Uncle Rooster, yes.
Sorry.
His Uncle Rooster died. And that's why he got him out of school. And so Steve figured it out. We were going pheasant hunting. No one had died other than a pheasant, hopefully. So we left that day and went pheasant hunting down to Redmond.
Tell us about, so the next story we want to go to is camping with the kids, Elvis Pelvis, and Enos Penis.
Well, I don't know if I better tell you that. But Elvis had a twin brother, which most of you don't know about. But you know about Elvis Pelvis. His twin brother was Enos Penis. I don't know how many times we should repeat that, but that Steve asked that question, didn't he?
Yeah. Tell us about camping and wieners up, wieners down.
Well, you know, that probably has a bad connotation too, I guess, in somebody's mind, not my mind, but in somebody's. So we used to always, when we were roasting wieners up or wieners down, when they're roasting the wieners. And I think some of you with corrupt minds might think of that being bad. But in my little virgin mind, it certainly wouldn't be bad.
So tell us about you water skiing with cowboys.
Well, there's actually a song, and I can't remember. He's a famous singer that sings. He actually made a video of him water skiing with a cowboy hat on. And so I put on my cowboy hat and water skied and didn't even get it wet. When I was through water skiing, I just slid down in the water but I used to love to water ski, but I had to water ski on double. I couldn't ever do a single. But I used to water ski all the time and really enjoyed doing it.
Tell us, let's see, the story about you and Sarah running into the track. And so.
Well, we were building a building down at BYU, and that's when I was working for another contractor that particular time. And it was the Joseph Smith building we were building down there, Memorial Building they called it. And so Sarah I would meet her after her school and after work, and we'd jog around the track down there on the campus. And then later on, when they moved to Draper, Sarah jogged with me quite a bit until she got pregnant, but we would jog around the block there about 5 o'clock in the morning, and she'd meet me down there and go jogging. And I loved to jog, and I did up until about 2 years ago. I had to kind of not jog as much because of my back, and it was causing me some problems. But
let's see, so 2 stories left. Number 1, you in school, in elementary school, and someone locked you in a closet. You know, I don't know if you were in trouble. What happened?
Well, I guess I got into a little trouble. Maybe I was a little mouthy or something. I don't know I can't remember what I did, but I certainly remember being in the closet. But these closets were huge. They were great big closets where the kids would all hang their coats and everything. And I don't think she locked the door, but she made me take my chair and go into this closet and sit. And I don't know if she forgot about me being in the closet or what, but I was in there quite a while. And her lunch was in there, so I ate her lunch because I was getting hungry. And So that made her even a little more upset with me that I'd eaten her lunch. And when she came in and remembered that I was in the closet. So as a child, that was quite a traumatic experience for me to be in the closet. But it turned out all right because I did have a lunch to eat anyway, so it wasn't that bad. I remember one time having problems with our garage door, and it was a spring. And so I got up on top of this 8-foot ladder and was going to try to tighten the spring. And when I did, it flipped me, and I went off the top of the 8-foot ladder, landed on my back on the concrete, and broke my back. I didn't know at the time that it broke it, but I literally had to crawl from the garage back to the house because I couldn't walk. It hurt so bad. And but I found years later that I actually had broken it at that time because they could see the break in the bone. One other little story I'm sure Steve wants me to tell about was a shaving incident. And because this happened not very long ago. And it's when I was in the hospital, and before having open heart surgery, I had to have my leg shaved and some of my other parts shaved and my chest shaved. And the fellow that came in to shave me was shaking just like this, had the razor in his hand. And I looked at Steve and looked back at this guy, and I thought, there is no way he's going to shave me. So I asked him, I said, well, have you ever shaved anybody? He says, no, and I'm really not sure exactly what I'm supposed to shave. And just then, I said, did you hear that on the intercom? He said, what? And I said, they called your name, that you're wanted somewhere else. They called you on the intercom. And he said, oh, did they? And so out he went. The minute he was out of the door, I called the nurse and says, hey, that guy is not shaving me. You get somebody else in here. I'm afraid what he's going to cut off. And so...
Did they even call his name, though?
No.
How old was this guy?
Well, he wasn't very old, but he was a little bit odd. I think. Well, he was especially nervous.
Yeah.
I think he had a little palsy or something, but he was not going to shave me.
Yeah.
And so finally the nurse came in and did it. But Steve and I had quite a laugh about this because somehow or other I convinced this kid to leave because they were calling his name. But anyway, it was a fun little time. How can you have fun when you're going to have your heart operated on is beyond me. And then Steve had to shower me in his suit. He had his suit on and I had to be showered. For some reason I couldn't do it. He had to use a big brush or something. So that was an interesting time when I had that heart surgery. Well, on the motorcycle, they have out in Draper what they call the Widowmaker, where they have these contests on motorcycles, whoever can get up to the top of the hill, and a lot of them never would make it. And I was bound and determined I was going to try it on my what do you call it? No, on my dirt bike, but it was I can't even think of it. Enduro, yeah. I was going to do it on this Enduro. And I got up quite a ways, and I was giving it the full gas and went up backwards, and fortunately it didn't really hurt me that bad. It kind of went on top of me, but Steve, I think, is the only one that knew I did that because I've never told anybody else. Because Sherry probably would have been very upset if she had known that. But, you got to do a few dumb tricks in life so that you do survive. But what was the other thing you were going to... Oh, Sally. I was the bishop of the singles ward, and Steve brought Sarah to sacrament meeting, and I couldn't remember what her first name was, but I knew it was Sally or Sarah, something like that. So I introduced her as Sally Latimer, and evidently that wasn't her name, it was Sarah. So I was close anyway.
And very last one. I mean, just not this has to be for the thing. do you have a happiest memory? So if the question was, what's your happiest memory? Do you have something to say, or you think you're good? You want to skip it?
Well, I'll tell you, recently my happiest memory was that I survived my open heart surgery. Because, I don't know if you're aware of this, but my heart wasn't functioning the way it should be after they got all done. And they were afraid that I had a bleeder in there, what they call a bleeder. So they were figuring they're going to have to open it all up. And 2 different times it didn't function properly. And we learned later on that a fellow that we knew had open heart surgery and died a week later. And so this isn't a operation that's not a difficult operation, and people die of it. And Sherry asked this other doctor what would have happened if his heart wouldn't have corrected itself. And he said, well, he'd have died. That's all there was to it. And so I think that's probably one of my happiest times that I can think of that happened recently, that I lived through all this. And so I'm very grateful that I'm still here and able to do this this little dumb video with you two clowns. So no, I'm grateful to be alive.
Cool. Well, thanks, Grandpa. I think we're good.
Okay.
Thanks for being on Dr. Phil.
Yeah. The Mari show.
Yeah.